In Lesson 6, we continue our look at basic jQuery operations with the DOM, looking specifically at DOM traversal. So what is this all about? Keep in mind that we're going to be thinking about the DOM as basically a tree-like representation of our HTML document. So if you think with me for a moment, your HTML document should have one root element. That's the HTML element. What would be the direct children of the HTML element in a well-formed document? As a hint, there should be two items, two direct children of HTML. Have you got the answer yet? Well, the two direct children of HTML should be head and body. Now, how about direct children of these elements? Well, head is probably going to have title as one of its children, which means that the HTML tag is the grandparent of title. You with me? Now how about body? What elements are going to be inside body? Well, that's where all the difference happens, right? Because depending on your page, you're going to have all kinds of content inside of body. But each of those elements that are directly inside of body are children of body, and therefore also grandchildren of HTML. So you can see, if we think about this in terms of a family tree, we have ancestors and descendants. We also have siblings. Head and body are siblings of each other. Elements directly inside of body are siblings of each other as well. So when we're talking about traversal, what we're talking about is moving around that tree, moving side to side between siblings, moving up the tree in terms of moving to ancestors, or moving down deeper in the tree, moving to descendants. So first of all, we want to talk about traversing siblings. And it's assumed that these are used with a selected element. So we're going to be attaching .next, .prev, .nextAll, etc. after a jQuery selector. So a $ parentheses, and then in quotes, a CSS selector. And then after those parentheses, .next, etc. So next is going to return the sibling immediately after the target element, if there is any such element. Otherwise, we get an empty jQuery object. Previous is the reverse. It's the sibling that came immediately before the target element, if there was one. So next and prev are going to return only one element that is the direct sibling, either before or after the element. Next all and prev all do similar ideas, but they're going to get every sibling, in the next all case, every sibling that comes after the target element. So all of the siblings to the end of that sibling chain, or prev all the siblings that came before the target element. So in either case, if there's only one, you'll only get one. But if there's 15 or 5,000, you would get all of those, as opposed to with the first two on this list, where we only would get the immediately adjacent one. And then .siblings returns all the siblings that are before and after the target element. So, you know, you might need only the ones that come after, you might need only the ones that come before, you might want all of the siblings, regardless of whether they're before or after. So you have utilities for doing each of those operations. Let's take a look through the exercise in Codio. All right, so here we have a document. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like in the browser. So we've got a masthead, we've got a left column and a right column. The right column contains two different shopping lists containing items that we might be picking up when we go shopping, and there are buttons that would eventually be used to create items. They don't do anything right now. But anyway, we've got lots of different elements here that we can use to practice traversing. So let's take a look at the structure over here. We're going to be working inside of body. So you can see that body has main and header as its two children. Header has an H1 and a P, so it's pretty simple. Main has the two divs. Remember the left side and the right side? The left side has mostly content, a little bit of nesting with a list here and a paragraph inside of this div. But the right side is a little more complex. The right side has two lists that are grouped into panels. All right, each panel has a panel header and a panel body. The panel header contains an H3 and the button. Remember, that's the button to add an item. And then the panel body actually has the list, so UL with LI items inside of it. I'd encourage you to just spend a little bit of time getting to know the structure yourself. You might find it helpful to actually look at it using the console and the Elements tab here, where you can kind of see that parent-child relationship as well. So just kind of get to know that a little bit. That will help you as you try to answer some of these questions on your own as we move in. So let's tackle this first section. First of all, we're still practicing installing jQuery in a page. So that, of course, means that we need to go to the Google hosted libraries and get jQuery. I think they've done a redesign recently. So we paste this in right above the body tag, and then we're going to put an actual script tag here where we can do our different coding. Okay, it's also a very good idea to have a DRE. I'm a fan of the shorthand form. So there we go. All right, so now with jQuery installed, with DRE ready, what we want to do is select the element that has an ID of item 2. So we're talking about this guy here. So you can imagine we might be wanting to do some traversal side to side with siblings with that one. So if we wanted to just select it, we would do it like this, right? Select it by its ID, and that ID is item 2. Okay, but we want to log its text to the console. So I'm going to save this whole item in a variable. All right, so now I have the item itself, the jQuery object, stored in item 2. So if I want to log its text, I'm going to start by logging item 2. But remember, if I just leave it at this, I'm going to get the actual jQuery object itself. So if I want to get its text, I have to go on to the end here and log text. Okay, cucumber is item 2. That's exactly right. Okay, so I've accomplished number 1 by selecting it, storing it in a variable, and logging its text value. Okay, that enables me to do number 2, where I want to move to the adjacent sibling, the next adjacent sibling at that, and log its text. So I could say var next item is assigned, and I'm going to start at item 2 and traverse to the next adjacent sibling, which is just .next. All right, so then to log its content, I'm going to go next item dot text. What's the next item? Should be peppers, right? Good. Cucumber and then peppers. All right, so we've accomplished number 2. So notice how in these cases, I'm storing the items themselves in the variable and then using those variables to drill in to get the text values in each of these cases. And because I had stored item 2 in a variable, I could traverse to its next element. It's just the same thing as if I had gone like this, item 2 dot next. Okay, but because I had already stored item 2 in this variable, I can just use the variable here. Same thing. All right, so number 3, log all previous siblings of the current selection to the console. So you're going to see this in the exercises for this lesson. We're going to be talking about the current item. So I do want you to kind of be moving from one item to the next prompted item. In this case, we moved from item 2 to item 3. That's now stored in next item. That is now what we would consider our current selection. But we do technically still have item 2 back here that if we wanted to do something else off of item 2, we could. But so safe to assume that when I'm talking about current selection, you can assume it's whatever we selected in the last step, which might have been a traversal from some previous step. So in this case, we're going to log all the previous siblings of the current selection to the console. Okay, so the current selection is next item. We can get all the previous siblings by calling prev all. Okay, so that would give me all the previous elements. So I could either store that in a variable, something like this, and then log it. Okay, in this case, I'm just logging the children, so I don't need to go in, or I'm logging the whole group here. So I should see, an array or something like that. Yep, indeed, I've got a list of all previous items. So if I'm on item 3, all previous items should be just these 2. Okay, so I stored it in a variable first and then logged that variable. But because I'm not doing anything else with it necessarily, it would have been sufficient for the record, same thing, if I had just simply logged next item dot prev all. Okay, so in this case, I didn't have any need to store it in a variable. I'm just logging it directly, and you just got to know the situation to know whether you need to store it in a variable. When in doubt, store it in a variable and then log the variable. Then you've got the variable in case you need it. All right, now we're going to try a couple other options, and notice we're kind of getting a clean break. So we're going to assume now that when I say select item 9, you can drill directly to item 9. You don't have to traverse around to get to item 9. Okay, so we're going to store it in a variable, assumingly. Item 9 is item 9. All right, and log its text to the console. So once again, we're just doing that to demonstrate that we've accomplished the goal. So item 9.text goes to the console. That should be lime juice. Sounds like we're making curry chicken and rice. Curry lime chicken is one of our family favorites. Okay, and then we're going to display its siblings in the console. So since I'm knowing that all I want to do is log, I'm just going to go straight to log. And so how do I do that? I'm going to go item 9. All of its siblings would be siblings. Okay, so we didn't practice all of the methods that were covered in that previous slide that we looked at. We did just next, prev-all, and siblings, but you can feel free to experiment with the others. So in this case, we selected lime juice, but we should, if we get all of its siblings, we should have a list of 4 items containing curry sauce, rice, mango, and coconut milk. Oh, I'm just getting hungry thinking about it. Okay, and indeed we did. We've got 6, 7, 8. We had selected 9, so the other sibling of 9 should be 10. Okay, so we don't get 9 in the list. 9 was what we started with. We are okay to go. Okay, so you've seen a few of these. Feel free to experiment with the others. All right, so we talked about the fact that elements in this DOM tree have siblings, but that they also have descendants. These would be children or elements that go deeper, elements that are nested inside of the selected element. So again, we're assuming that we have selected an element and either stored it in a variable or we're tacking straight on to the end here. So with the first one, children returns all the direct children of the target element. So all the elements that are directly inside of this element. All right, we also have this very helpful one called find that takes a selector as its single parameter. And this allows us to search deep multi-layers inside of an element to find a particular element or set of elements that are inside of it. So in the first case here, we just are getting the direct children regardless of what they are. You actually can pass in a selector inside of the parentheses in children to further filter it to children that are only of a certain type, but there you have it. But the find element does a deep search, and it goes as far as needed throughout the descendant tree in order to find all the matching elements. So very helpful if you are starting with a parent and you want to go down somewhere inside of it looking for a certain kind of element, something with a class of a certain type, for example, but you don't know how many layers it is in. Find is the kind of shortcut, easy way to get there. Otherwise, you'd have to go children and look through each child and then dive deeper and deeper, and so find is a shorter way to do that. So let's practice with those. Moving on to the next page in the demo, we find opportunities to practice with these. So I'm going to clear this guy out so we have a fresh point here. All right, so we're going to select shopping list and log its children. Well, where is shopping list? Looks like it's right here. What should we expect to see as its direct children? Well, we should see an H2 and list 1 and list 2, and that is all. So let's see if we did our figuring correctly. So shopping list is assigned. Selector, shopping list. Okay, and then we're going to log its children. Okay, so we've stored the list itself in the variable shopping list. So if we want to log its children, we can call shopping list.children. And let's see what we get. Good, there are 3 items, an H2, list 1, and list 2. Great. Did exactly what we figured it would. All right, let's try number 2. So now we're going to select shopping list and log its descendants, but those that have the class of panel. And we're going to store the first of them in a list, in this list, in a new variable called list1. So there's many things going on here, several steps. Let's take it one piece at a time. So first we want to select shopping list and log its descendants. Okay, so here we've already selected shopping list. So let's log its descendants, but only the descendants that have the class of panel. So you may recall that we had that nice shortcut .find, and we could pass into it a selector such as all those that have class panel. So if we selected shopping list, that should be this. If we were going to try to log its children that have or descendants that have the class of panel, well, here's one and here's one. They turns out that they are direct children of this element, but it could be that they were multiple layers in. We would still catch them as long as they have that class of panel. So all that to say, we should see 2 children that result from this. Let's go take a look. Indeed, there they are. So we basically kind of filtered out the H2 with this operation, but nothing wrong with that for our purposes. But next in this very same step, it says store the first item in this list in a new variable called list1. So where we're headed is we're going to want a variable called list1, and we're going to assign to it sort of the first item out of this. So it's something like as if we had an array, we would be calling the first item out of that array, like this, right? Does that ring a bell? Well, we don't actually have this array right now because all we did was just log that directly here. So instead of logging it directly, let's assign those results to a variable. Something like var panels is assigned shopping list.find panels. Okay, so now if we log panels, you'll see panels contains an array. Okay, right, it's just telling me that error because the array variable I just stuck in there. So that'll go away in a moment, but proving the point that we've now gotten the same results by first storing the results there in a variable and then logging that variable. So now, if we want to grab the first item, we would go panels sub 0. Okay, so we've got that in list 1. We're not told to log it, but let's just log it to kind of check to see that we're on the right track. Good. We are. All right, so the next step says find the list group that's inside of list 1 and store it in a variable called list1 group. So what are we talking about there? So we first selected shopping list, and then we selected only the panels that are somewhere inside of shopping list. So that got us list 1 and list 2. Then we just selected the first one by grabbing the first item out of our panels result list. Okay, so that's stored in list 1. Now we want to go inside of list 1 to find the list group. All right, so that's multiple layers down. Another opportunity for us to practice the find method. So we're going to store it in list1 group. And I forgot to put the dollar signs in the prompt here, but keep in mind that the convention is to name our variables with dollar signs at the beginning when those variables contain actual jQuery objects. So Yeah, that's actually right. This one here is actually an array, so it would most actually be best to omit the $ there, but I'm getting nitpicky. Bottom line, if you're working with the DOM and you're not sure, use a $. For the jQuery operation to help yourself remember there. Anyway, list group 1, we're going to go inside of list 1 and we're going to find anything that has a class of list group. All right, so that should find this list here that has items 1 through 5 in it. Okay, and let's just log our results to make sure that we're on track. And that problem is that when we used this direct method of getting the first item out of this array, what we actually got out was just a plain old DOM element, not an actual jQuery element. And that's why it's saying that the find method is not a function. So this is a little opportunity to point out for you that if you get this error, it likely means that you're trying to do a jQuery method, find in this case, with something that is actually not a jQuery object. So if you see not a function, you should go back to that variable and ask yourself, where did I get that variable and how can I make sure that it becomes a jQuery object? So the answer to that is here is where we're assigning a value to list 1. And the simple answer, if ever you want something to be a jQuery object, is to just wrap that thing with the jQuery function call here. So $ parentheses. And then whatever we pass into this will be, well, at least as long as it's recognized by jQuery as something that can become a jQuery object, it will convert it to a jQuery object. So watch what changes now here where we're logging list 1. It will now become this jQuery looking thing. So it looks a little bit more like the others. So a little nuance to get used to. I wish it wasn't that complex, but there you have it. So now we can, it is a jQuery object, so we can call .find on it, and then we end up with the actual list group. So there is the list group. That list group has all kinds of stuff inside of it. Okay, so we've got list group. Now we want to select the children of list group and add a class of active to them. Okay, so now we're actually kind of moving beyond just traversing, and that we actually want to actually do something with the things that we're selecting. So essentially, where we're going is we're going to want to traverse from list group to its children. We don't know which ones. We just want to go directly to the children. And then we want to add the class of active to them. Well, do you remember how to add a class? We covered this in the last lesson. It's the add class method. So we, thankfully, can just tack it right on here, and jQuery recognizes that we're trying to do this operation on a list, and it will kind of iterate through that whole list and add whatever class we tell it to. So we want to add the active class. So let's watch what happens. They should all turn blue because they all now have the class of active added onto them dynamically. See, there it is. All right, so they don't have that class by default. We just use jQuery to add that class to the whole list. All right, so now you've seen a little bit of practice with descendant selectors, both the children selector that grabs the direct children and the find method that looks deep inside of an element, as deep as necessary to get all of the elements that match the selector we provided. We even saw that we can chain on a one of the other things we learned about last lesson, such as add class. All right. Last of all, we have ancestor selectors, and there are 3. We have parent, which returns the direct parent of the target element, so the one parent in this case, and parents returns all the ancestors of the target element. So if we had, say, a header inside of body, and we had selected header and called parent, we would just get body. But if we call parents, we would get body and HTML, because body is the direct parent and HTML is the direct parent of body, so we would get those 2 elements. So it's a little different from when we're doing descendant traversal, in that there could be any number of descendants and many branches, underneath that. But when we head back up the tree, we're really going to have one parent, and that element will have one parent, and that element will have one parent if it has any at all. Okay. The third method is similar to the find method that we had with descendants, but it goes the other direction. So closest returns the closest ancestor, so the ancestor that is nearest to the target element. So the closest ancestor of the target element that matches the provided selector. So whereas find allows us to get a whole set of elements that are descendants that match, some filter, with closest, we're going to search back up the ancestor tree for the first thing that we find that matches the provided selector. So we might pass in a class that allows us to kind of traverse up the tree to that particular thing and stop right there. So this is very helpful in that often what we're going to want to do is move from one element to something else that may be a sibling, maybe a sibling's descendant, maybe a descendant of one of its parents. So what we'll often want to do when we've selected something is first traverse out and then traverse back in. So this pattern of starting with an element and traversing out with closest and then back down to some other element with find is something you're going to want to get used to. And we'll practice with that next, as well as have an opportunity to see all of this in context on page 3. So we'll be in Codio the rest of the time here now. Let's take a look at page 3. So we're going to select info, and then we're going to traverse to its immediate parent and log its class. So where is info? Here is info. So let's select info and log its parent's class. So var info, select info. Okay, so now we want to log its parent's class. So log info.parent.attribute. Which attribute? The class attribute. All right, let's see what we get. Good, it has a class of row. Is that indeed the case? Sure it is. There's one parent, and it has the class of row. Let's just prove a point and take a look at what all the parents look like. So if we console.log info.parents, remember this is now going to make a list of all of the parents of the target element. So we started here, so we should get main, and then body, and then HTML. Let's see what we get. Good, there's a list of 3 things: main, body, HTML. Indeed. All right. Good, so let's wipe these out just to get a clean start. Now we want to select list 1. And traversed up to the nearest row. Okay, so row is going to be list 1 dot. Now remember, with the nearest something or other that's a parent, we're going to want to use the closest method, and then we provide a filter for the thing we're looking for. So if that thing happens to be its direct parent, we're there. In fact, it actually turns out that if this element itself has this class, we would actually stop here. It does actually check the element itself first, but assuming we're moving out at some different level, we have now stored that in a variable, and now we want to log its parents itself. So we're going to go row.parents. So let's think about what we've just done. We started with list 1, which is here, and we moved out to the closest row. So here's list 1. Where is the closest row? Well, here's one parent. That does not have a class of row, so we'll move out one more level to main. Good. So main has a class of row, so we would have stopped here. So the main tag is what is stored in row. So when we log row.parents, we should see body and HTML, because those are the parent descendants of that row. Let's check it out. Good, exactly as we thought. Okie dokie, so there you have work with parent and parents and closest. Now let's dive in and do a more in-depth exercise to get a sense of how this actually works in the real world. So let me just pause quickly and say that part of the exercise you're going to be doing for this lesson is going to be rote, mundane practice traversing, because this is so essential. I wanted to give you lots and lots of practice with this. So you're going to start with some element, you're going to traverse up or sideways or down to a new element, and then traverse from that new element up or sideways or down. It just depends on the situation. And then there may be times where I tell you to traverse out to parents just broadly. There may be other times where I'll challenge you to traverse to a specific element, and you're going to have to figure out what's the simplest way to get there by backing out to some common ancestor and then down to that descendant or something along those lines. Perhaps it's direct side by side to a direct sibling or something like that. So lots of opportunities to practice and just kind of get your head around how this traversal works. But so here, now let's work through an example of how this might actually function in the real world. So to get started, I've given you some code that is basically an event all-in-one handler. So we are going to cover events in a future lesson, but we're selecting this element, the element with the class of button add. We're listening for click events on this element, and we're responding with this function. We've stored the button that was clicked in the variable button, and we're ready to move. So let's just imagine what's happened here. Where are there things that have a class of button add? Well, they are these buttons for where we can add items, and there are two of them. So when we listen for a click, if we console log button clicked to just kind of test where we are, we should see that message regardless of which button we press. Okay, and we should not see it when we click elsewhere because we haven't clicked on that button, right? Okay, but we're using the same handler to deal with this. So now if you think about it, if we click on this button to add an item, where would you expect to see that item? Well, you'd probably expect to see it in this list and not this list, right? Likewise, if you click here, you'd expect to see the new item in this list, not this list. So this is where traversal comes in very handy. We have responded to a click on this button, and in order to add an item to this list, we're going to need to traverse from this button to the related list, rather than just, assuming that we selected this list and added onto here. No, we might have been on this button and therefore need to add to this list. So we're not always going to know exactly which list had been clicked. So we use traversal to move from whichever button was clicked to the corresponding list. And thankfully they have the same structure. So let's imagine how we might do that. Here's the item, and if we're going to add an item down here, well, we might traverse up to the panel heading, and then to its sibling panel body, and then down to the list group, where we can then add an item. So that was several steps. We would have traversed up to panel heading, that's one step, sideways to a sibling panel body, then down to a child list group. So that was like 3 steps, right? Well, it's even simpler if we think about the highest up common ancestor, which would be this guy right here. If we go any higher up, then we might accidentally switch lists. Okay, so if we traverse from the button up to the panel, that's one step. So we would have done closest panel. And then if we want to now traverse down to the list group, we can then do find, we then do find list group. So that was only 2 steps to get to where we needed to be. All right, so that's perhaps the idea of where we're going. Skipping over some of my dialogue here, feel free to read it at your own pace. So we want to traverse from the list group or from this thing to the nearest list group. So I'm going to talk through here what we exactly just discussed here. So we're going to traverse up from button to the nearest panel. So from button, we're going to go to panel. And so we get there by going button dot closest thing with a class of panel. All right, that has ensured that we've stayed inside of the actual kind of list context. You know, panel is the farthest out ancestor that the list and the button have in common. All right, we've stored that in panel. Now we're going to traverse down from panel to list group that's inside of it and store it in a new variable called list group. So var list group is assigned panel dot find list group. Okay, we're going to disregard the first thing here because I think we're really already in that context. And we've already looked at how to trim down to the first result if we want to. Okay, so we've done that. We have traversed up. Let's just console log our result to make sure we are in the right place. So if we click on item, we should see the corresponding list. So we definitely got a list group, but is it chicken, cucumber, peppers, etc.? Let's see. It has children. And yep, looks like we've got the right list. Okay, so if we click on this button, we should see that corresponding list. Very good. All right, it's working as expected. We are on a roll. Okay, so now we should prepare a list item to add inside the list. So now we're going to do a couple of things that might be new, but are going to be common, where now that we've kind of gotten in the right situation, we're going to want to add some new element at the end of this list. And we've kind of done this with append so far, but there's a couple other nuances here to demonstrate for you. So if we want to create an actual new item, we can do it like this, a new actual DOM item. So that's the jQuery selector, right? So if we put inside of this not just a selector like this, li, but an actual tag like this, even if it's not a full, open closing tag, this little difference of actually including an actual tag there transforms what this very versatile jQuery selector does. And what actually happens is we get a new DOM element created. Now it's just in memory, we haven't put it on the page anywhere yet, but because we've done that, we can now do jQuery operations with it. So you'll see that the next thing we want to do is add a class of list group item onto this. So you can see we're going to build one of these, and if we want to match the idea here, we've got to add a corresponding class to it so that it gets the same styles. So we can go new item dot add class list group item. Now remember, when we're adding a class, we don't need the period here. We just want the class name. Okay, so we have added that, and now we want to actually write a message into our new item. So same idea, we're going to select new item, and if we want to put a message into it, we would be writing text content. So we're going to add a new item to our list. Let's say we want, I don't know, cookies. Imagine that. Okay, so now we have written the message, and let's just kind of check our progress. Again, we should not actually see this new item appear anywhere. We're just logging it to the console to see if that we've kind of built things the way we expected. So add item to this list. So there's the list group itself, and there is our new item. And if we open it up, we should be able to see that its text content is cookies. Good. Yay. All right, but all this gobbledygook over here on the right is no good. We want that thing right here, right? We want that on our list so we can get us some cookies. Okay, so the other thing we have to do is to actually add an ID that has a new number. So you can see that they're numbered 1 through 5 and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So if we add a new item, we're going to want to go to the next highest number, from all of these so that each one has a unique number. Well, how in the world would we do that? Well, we could take account of the number of items that we have, add one to that, and use that to create the ID. So how would we do that? Well, this involves children. We're going to want to kind of select all of the things that have this list group item class and find out how many there are. Okay, so we're going to want to start broadly enough that we can count all of the items. Okay, so that means that we're going to need to not just be in this one panel, but in the whole shopping list. Okay, so we want to first traverse up from panel to the nearest shopping list. So var shopping list is assigned panel dot closest shopping list. Okay, so we traversed up from the selected panel to shopping list as a whole, and now we can look inside of shopping list for all of the elements inside of it that have the class of list group items. So var all list items is assigned shopping list dot find, and then we want the list group item. Okay, so we've stored them. Let's console log what we've got. So we click on an item first in order to see this, and aha, we have 10 items. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it spans the whole list. See here the power of the find method. Okay, so if we want to go one more than that, we need to access, kind of find out how many items there are. So we just looked over in the console and found that there were 10. But notice that this object that we have here has a property called length that tells us how many items there are in it. So we can use the length of this list in a new variable. So var num items is assigned all list items dot length. Now notice that I did not put a $ in front of num items because the value stored in num items is not a jQuery object. Remember, the convention was to use a $ at the beginning of a variable that contains a jQuery object. And num items is just the length of this other variable. So we do not need a $ there, and you'll see it is just a number, the number 10. Okay, so that is a number stored in num items. So next I can increment that by 1 and store that new item, that new number, in the variable new ID num. So that's going to be assigned num items plus 1. All right, so now console log. You see how much I use console log to just check my work as I'm going? Eventually we'd want to clean this up and remove the console logs we don't want, but just as a debugging tool, it's very helpful. Okay, so we had 10 items, and now we've incremented that to 11. Now we haven't actually added the new item to the page yet, so right now if we keep clicking item, item, we still have the same number, but that will all change very soon. So we've incremented that, stored that in new ID num. Now we can add an ID attribute onto new item. So remember, new item is our new DOM list item, right? So we can say new item dot attribute, because we're going to want to write a new attribute. Which attribute? The ID. What value? Well, here we're going to want to follow the convention that we have, where the IDs begin with item dash and then are followed by a number. So that number is stored in new item ID, new ID num, that is. So we're going to go item dash and then concatenate on new ID num. Okay, and because we started with a string, JavaScript knows to make this the concatenation operator, not the plus operator, even though this is a number. So this will be converted to a string and concatenated on right after this. So our new item should get the item dash 11. Well, as long as it's the 11th item. All right, so now we're just logging new item to just check its configuration. So we don't need to log it up here. In fact, we can probably pull out some of our previous logs since we know we're in good shape. All right, so let's check it. We should have a new item that has an ID of item 11. Good. And if we keep clicking, again, we haven't actually added this to the page, so we're going to continue to get item 11. But the time is coming where this will change, because in step 12, we actually append new item onto the end of list group. So remember, list group is created up here. That's where we went from the panel down to the list group element. So that would be, whichever corresponding one that goes with the button that we clicked. So say we're here, we're going to go into here and add a new item to the bottom of it, but inside. So if you remember, we had the option to do before, right? And also after. But we want this to go inside, in which case we have the append for inside but at the end, or what was the other one? Do you remember? Prepend. Okay, so we want the new item. Let's see. We could actually put it either place. Let's see, did we put instructions here? Append it. So we're assuming we want to put it to the end of the list, but let's just kind of change that up. Let's put it at the beginning of the list so that we kind of see it right away at the top of the list. So we want to use the, we want to use the prepend method. So we're going to go list group.prepend, and then we just pass in new item. Okay. Last of all, we want to select the message element and write the following as its plain text content. So we're basically kind of just giving ourselves a little message. So we can go to the thing with an ID of message and write its plain text content to contain the message item new ID num was added. Okay, so that's selecting this guy right here, ID message, and so we will be replacing this content with our message that contains the actual ID number of the thing that we just added. Okay, so let's watch it all work. So we add an item, we should see it appear here, and we should see a message here showing the ID 11. Good, so we got cookies, at the top of the list, and it's on this list, not this list. That's correct. So we need more cookies, right? Aha, look at that. Item 12 was added. So we have item 11 and 12. What if we add it to the other list? Okay, we've added a new item, so there are now a total of 13 items, so that one should be ID 13, and everything is working. So yeah, we need lots of cookies. Let's put much cookie in on there. Cool. And if we inspect them, you should see the actual ID number was indeed incrementing each time. Okay, so this is cool in that we got an item added, but next steps that we might actually take in a real application would be to actually allow the user to enter here what they want. We would probably not build an application that just adds cookies to people's lists, although that would be rather tasty. All right, enjoy the exercise.